Should you get the new 13-inch M2 iPad Air or a refurbished M1/M2 12.9-inch iPad Pro, which you can buy for almost the same price as this new iPad Air? Well, you'll be surprised, as the iPad Pro isn't necessarily better in every single way. So I'm going to compare all the main differences, from the design and feel to the display, the speakers, cameras, all the way down to the value, to help you guys decide which one is the right choice for you. And I want to start off with the design and feel. Even though I expected them to feel the same in the hand, they do not. The iPad Air actually feels better. And that's because it is both thinner and lighter than the iPad Pro. It's only thinner by 0.3 millimeters, but even that's enough for me to be able to notice this in my hand. Now, the bigger difference is when it comes to the weight, with the iPad Air being 65 grams lighter. It's not quite as thin as light as the new M4 iPad Pro, but compared to the M2 iPad Pro, I much prefer holding the Air. Another advantage to the Air is that you also get 4 colors to choose from instead of just 2. Although, I'm not really a huge fan of the colors on the iPad Air, as they are very washed out. This one right here is apparently the purple, although it pretty much looks like silver. Another design difference is that the silver version of the iPad Air no longer comes with a SIM card slot. It is eSIM only, whereas the M2 iPad Pro does. So if you do travel a lot, then the iPad Pro will be the better option here, as physical SIM will always be cheaper and more accessible. Which brings me to the display. And here, the iPad Pro is supposed to be better in every way, but it's actually not. You see, despite both having the same manual brightness of 600 nits, to me the Air does seem to be brighter, which was especially visible outdoors. It wasn't a huge difference compared to the iPad Pro, but it was there. Other than that, the iPad Pro's display is indeed superior in every single way. When you're watching HDR content, it goes crazy bright, up to 1600 nits. So the colors simply pop and everything on screen just looks so good. All of this is thanks to the mini LED display on the iPad Pro, which although it doesn't match the OLED on the new M4 iPad Pros, as it does have some blooming when you're watching content in low light, it is miles better than the LCD panel on the iPad Air, which I found to be lacking the brightness and of course the deep blacks of the mini LED. However, I think that the biggest difference is when it comes to the refresh rate. The iPad Air still only comes with a 60Hz display compared to the 120Hz on the iPad Pro. And I don't know if it's simply just me being used to 120Hz, but the iPad Air actually feels slower than 60. Another area in which the iPad Pro is superior is when it comes to the speakers. The iPad Air comes with 0 speakers, so 1 on each side, whereas the iPad Pro comes with 4 speakers, so 2 on each side. So let's do a quick test. I used to be like that way back when I was way back. Wow, that was a huge difference. Not only was the iPad Pro clearer and with more bass, but it was also significantly louder. MacPod, a company behind Clean My Mac, have recently launched Clean My Phone for mobile devices, including the iPad. Clean My Phone is my favorite mobile cleanup app. It helps me organize my files and remove tons of unnecessary photos, like over 40 gigabytes of screenshots and screen recordings that it found. This frees up space for when I want to shoot ProRes videos or install some large games and apps. The interface is super user-friendly, showing duplicates and blurry photos that I can remove with ease. It also automatically sorts portraits, pets, food, travel, and text photos into theme-based folders. And everything is processed on device, so you don't even need an internet connection, making it a perfect way to make good use of your flight. Try Clean My Phone for free for the first 3 days on both iPad and iPhone by using the link below. Now, when it comes to the cameras, there are a number of differences here too. The iPad Pro also features an ultra-wide module on the back, which Apple actually removed from the new M4 iPad Pros. The iPad Air only has a single module. Personally, I don't think that this is a big of a deal, as not many people use an iPad as their primary camera, but in some cases, having the ultra-wide might be useful. For example, my mom has an iPad Pro and an iPhone XS, and since her iPhone XS does not have an ultra-wide module at all, she actually uses the one on the iPad Pro. But if you only care about the main camera, then you'll be happy to hear that it is exactly the same on both, even down to the image processing. Now, the iPad Pro also has a lighter module on the back for augmented reality apps, which I've actually used in the past for measuring furniture or placing furniture using the IKEA Place app. Although the iPad Air also supports augmented reality apps, And in Apple's Measure app, for example, it does seem to be almost as accurate as the iPad Pro. You also get ProRes support on the iPad Pro in case you do want to shoot videos on the iPad Pro directly and then grade them in Final Cut for the iPad. And you also get a flash, which can be useful for when you're scanning documents, although in my case, I have found myself using it as a torch around my house on a few occasions. One more camera difference is that the iPad Pro features a vertical front camera, whereas the iPad Air features a landscape one. So if you do tend to use your iPad with a Magic Keyboard as well, then the iPad Air will be far better. So this is a front-facing camera and a microphone test on the brand new iPad Air. You can see how good that camera placement is. Now the iPad Air also has 2 microphones compared to 5 on the iPad Pro, so let me know if there's any difference in terms of the audio quality as well. And now here's a beautiful front-facing camera test on the M2 iPad Pro. You can see how great that viewing angle is, but do let me know if the iPad Pro sounds any better since it has 5 microphones. Let me know if you notice any difference in terms of the audio quality at least. On top of this, since the iPad Pro also features Face ID, so LiDAR on the front as well, you can also take front portrait mode photos, which you cannot take on the iPad Air at all. And you also cannot take these with the back-facing camera of the iPad Pro for some reason, even though we do have LiDAR on the back, which is very strange. And speaking of Face ID, this is one of my favorite things on the iPad Pro, being able to unlock it by just using my face, as opposed to having to use that fingerprint reader built into the power button like on the iPad Air. And to me, Face ID is just so much better, especially on a tablet. I'm simply not a fan of having to constantly rotate my iPad around to find that fingerprint reader in order to unlock my iPad. Even if Apple does give me this indicator as to where I have to place my finger, it's just very inconvenient. And it's even worse for when you're using the Magic Keyboard. Being able to simply swipe up on the trackpad to start using my iPad like I can with my iPad Pro is just amazing. Which brings me to the Magic Keyboard. This one is identical between the two. The only difference here being the total weight. With the Magic Keyboard attached, the iPad Pro weighs 1.38 kilograms, while the Air weighs 1.315. So 65 grams lighter. Still not quite as light as the new M4 iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard, which weighs 1.251 kilograms, or as light as the 13-inch MacBook Air, which weighs 1.237. But hey, when you're traveling, every gram counts, and there's no denying that between the M2 Air and the M2 Pro, the Air is the lighter package. Another keyboard difference here is that the iPad Pro also supports Apple's Smart Keyboard Folio, which is not only $150 cheaper than the Magic Keyboard, but it is also noticeably lighter, at 407 grams as opposed to 693. It doesn't come with a trackpad and the keys are also quite mushy, but hey, if you want a more affordable keyboard for your iPad that's also made by Apple, that only works with the iPad Pro. Which brings us to the Apple Pencil. And the Apple Pencil is actually the main reason why you should consider the M2 iPad Air as opposed to the M2 iPad Pro. And that's because, unlike the Pro, the Air also supports the new Apple Pencil Pro, which comes with a number of improvements. For example, you can now squeeze it to bring up this tool menu that allows you to quickly change the brush type, the brush size, and more. Whereas with a second-gen Apple Pencil, which is the highest end that the iPad Pro supports, you'll have a separate tool menu that will take up some of your screen space. The Apple Pencil Pro also gives you haptic feedback whenever you squeeze it, and also when you double tap to change the tool, which I've also found to be far more reliable than on the second-gen Apple Pencil. Additionally, the Apple Pencil Pro also allows you to rotate the tip of the brush just by rotating the Apple Pencil itself. This barrel roll feature is something that Zara from my team is a big fan of. She paints and draws, and she was even considering an M2 iPad Air because of this feature, which does not work with the iPad Pro at all. On top of this, you also have Find My functionality with the Apple Pencil Pro, which allows you to locate the Apple Pencil if you somehow lose it, although it simply uses Bluetooth as opposed to having an ultra-wide chip inside, like the AirTag, so you'll only get a rough area in which you've lost it rather than a precise location. Both pencils on both iPads support the hover functionality, which lets you see the cursor before you start using the Apple Pencil, which is great, but the Apple Pencil Pro goes a step further on the iPad Air and shows you the shadow in software of the tool that you've got selected. In fact, Apple even created full 3D models for these, which I find absolutely incredible. Now, there is one advantage that the iPad Pro has over the iPad Air when it comes to using the Apple Pencil, and that is the response time. Since we've got a 120Hz display on the iPad Pro, using the Apple Pencil just feels way more responsive than on the Air. Still, plenty of designers still use iPad Airs for their work. Our WallpaperZ creator, Matthew, aka Wallrod, has recently upgraded to an M1 iPad Air from his previous iPad 9th gen, and he's made some of our most stunning packs for WallpaperZ yet, like Wild Wonders, Sahara Summits, Heavenly Horizons, Heroic Heroes, and many more. and 120Hz wasn't something that Matthew necessarily missed. In fact, all of these new features of the new Apple Pencil Pro seem to be a far bigger deal to most designers than 120Hz is. And as always, all of our latest wallpapers are in the description box down below. Also, we have recently launched our new Japanese Joyland pack by Hana, with these beautiful colorful depictions of Japanese art, which you can also check out in WallpaperZ as well. Which brings us to the performance. Both of these iPads do come with the exact same M2 chip. However, we did actually see some unexpected performance differences. In Geekbench 6, we saw fairly similar numbers for their CPU performance. However, when we tested their GPU, the iPad Pro was 11% faster, which was very strange. So we then tested the GPU in 3D Mark Solar Test, and here the iPad Pro was 6.6% faster. So at first I thought that maybe the cooling was just worse on the iPad Air. However, they both scored a 70% stability score, so the cause for this performance difference was still unclear. We tested Final Cut Pro as well, and here we exported the sample Lunar New Year project, which we've duplicated 5 times, and this took the iPad Air 1 minute and 48 seconds, whereas the iPad Pro took 1 minute and 36 seconds. So the iPad Pro was 11% faster here as well. So at this point, my guess was that Apple simply clocks the iPad Air's M2 chip lower compared to the iPad Pro. So we had to look at the readings in Geekbench, and it does seem like Apple is running the M2 chip inside the iPad Pro at an ever so slightly higher clock speed. However, this isn't quite the difference that I was expecting to see here. Weirdly enough, Geekbench also shows the iPad Air having more usable memory at 7.45 gigabytes out of 8, as opposed to 7.31 on the iPad Pro. So honestly, I'm not really sure why we're seeing such a big 10% performance difference in some cases, as that clock speed difference is quite minimal. Maybe that's just the initial clock speed reading, which possibly drops more on the Air for whatever intended or unintended reason by Apple. Now we've also tested a game, Resident Evil 4, and the performance looked to be the same on both here. What was different though were the thermals. The iPad Air felt significantly cooler to the touch, which makes me think that this has something to do with the mini LED display inside the iPad Pro, which likely requires more power for the dimming zones, that can also make it go far brighter, hence heating up the iPad more. And lastly, we've also tested the file transfer speed through an external SSD, as the iPad Pro does have a Thunderbolt port capable of 40 gigabit per second transfer speeds as opposed to the iPad Air's 10 gigabit per second USB-C port. Unfortunately, we did not have an actual Thunderbolt SSD to test this, but using our roughly 800 megabyte per second external drive, we were able to see a difference, with the iPad Air transferring an 18 gigabyte video file in 59 seconds as opposed to just 35 on the iPad Pro, or 40% faster. So if you plan to constantly transfer photos and files to and from your iPad, then the iPad Pro is going to be the one to get. Okay, so having said all of this, which one gives you more value? Well, the 128GB M2 iPad Air costs $800. The M2 iPad Pro is not currently on Apple's refurbished store just yet, but it will be there soon, most likely replacing the current M1 model, which they're selling for $830 for the 256GB model. So you can simply wait for the M2 version to show up on the refurbished store, or just get the M1 model right now, which gives you everything that the M2 model does, the only difference being slightly less performance, which most people will never even use to the fullest, and the lack of Apple Pencil hover. But aside from that, the M1 model is identical. Plus, if you go for the iPad Pro, you can also get a second-gen Apple Pencil refurbished for $109. In which case, the total cost would be $1,289, whereas an equivalent 256GB iPad Air would be $1,379. And I think that if you're a graphic designer, you should absolutely go with the iPad Air because of the Apple Pencil Pro features. Whereas if you're someone who enjoys watching content more and you don't really use the Apple Pencil much, then I would go for the iPad Pro because of that mini LED 120Hz display and the much better speakers. And a pro tip, once the M2 iPad Pro is added to the refurbished store, the price of the M1 model would then drop even further. So that's when it would become a great idea to actually pick an M1 iPad Pro up. So yeah, I hope this helped. Hopefully you have now made your decision. Check out WallpaperZ using the link below. And yeah, stay tuned for more iPad videos in the coming days. I'm Daniel, it's been ZONEofTECH, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.